Good evening, everybody. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims, the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. It is a pleasure to welcome Richard Stengel to campus for this conversation on his new book, Information Wars: How We Lost the Global Battle Against Disinformation and What We Can Do About It. That book is for sale outside, and he'll be signing copies after the program. I know from working with Rick a long time ago that he has a keen gift for crystallizing what's important and a gorgeous way with words. So we are in for a special treat this evening. And we are also pleased to welcome back Cecile Shea of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Cecile is a good friend of the IOPs, and it is always a delight to have her. I do want to mention a few upcoming events. Next Tuesday, 8-time NBA All-Star, you'll appreciate this, Rick, and humanitarian Dikembe Mutombo will be coming to the IOP to speak on his philanthropic efforts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Next Thursday, former Director of Policy for the State Department, Ambassador Dennis Ross, comes to the IOP to unpack September's influential Israeli elections in conversation with Stora Rowley, formerly of the Chicago Tribune. And Tuesday, November 5th, we're hosting a preview of the 2020 election 1 year out with a panel of journalists from PBS NewsHour, Politico, and current IOP fellow Enrique Acevedo from Univision. The IOP hosts public events all year on a variety of issues. The best way to stay in touch and sign up for those events is at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. I want to mention that after the discussion, as usual, we will have questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone that is going to be just behind this section here. And remember that everybody's welcome at the mic. So if you're a first year, we especially are interested in hearing from you. Don't be nervous. The question and answer period is the cornerstone of IOP events, and you are encouraged to come up, unless you're peddling disinformation, and then maybe not. As usual, we do give priority for the first 3 questions to students. I'd like to ask you to please make sure that your phones are on silent. And now, to formally introduce our speakers, is Sarah Graziano. Sarah is a second year from New York City, studying law, letters, and society. Here on campus, she is an editor at the Paul Douglas Institute, a student-run policy think tank, is involved with the IOP's USHI Votes effort, voter registration and turnout effort, and this past summer, she worked on voting rights issues at the Andrew Goodman Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Sarah to the podium.
Thank you so much for coming out all the way here to Illinois. I'm honored to welcome the accomplished Richard Stengel on behalf of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago. We are excited to have Mr. Stengel here today to discuss his new book, Information Wars: How We Lost the Global Battle Against Disinformation and What We Can Do About It. Mr. Stengel was the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs from 2013 to 2016, where he helped remodel the State Department's communications program and led the department's counter-disinformation efforts. Before working at the State Department, Mr. Stengel was the editor of Time. At Time, he oversaw print, digital, and marketing for the magazine. Notably, while Mr. Stengel was editor, Time won Magazine of the Year for the first time in history. Before his work at Time and the Department of State, Mr. Stengel was president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. He also served as a senior advisor and chief speechwriter for Bill Bradley's 2000 presidential campaign. Information Wars is by no means Mr. Stengel's first book. From 1992 through 1994, he worked with Nelson Mandela on his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. Mr. Stengel later wrote Mandela's Way, a New York Times bestseller on his experience working with Mandela. He is currently a political analyst for NBC and lives in the great city of New York. We are also very excited to have Cecile Shea here to moderate the conversation. Cecile Shea is a senior fellow on security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. She is the president of Wakaru Communications and an advisor to the Council's Next Generation programs. For over 2 decades, she was a U.S. diplomat working on Asian issues, from being a political advisor to the U.S. Marine Corps Pacific to her time as a press attaché and media analyst chief at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Her current research focuses on non-traditional security threats, such as unemployment, economic displacement, and demographic change. Please join me in welcoming Cecile Shea and Richard Stengel.
Well done. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. Welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
Great
Great to be here.
Yeah, very nice. Let's just get started. The book is great. I read it over the weekend.
Can I just ask the kids here one question?
Yeah.
Do you all know who Bill Bradley is?
There you go.
That's where Gretchen and I met. He ran for president in the 2000 cycle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
All right. We're not going to talk about Bill Bradley.
or we can talk about Bill Bradley because he was a tremendous senator. So maybe that will come up and when we talk about public service. But let's just get, why did you write this book? I mean, you've written or helped to write what may be the most important book of the second half of the 20th century. You've had multiple fabulous careers. I was referring to the Nelson Mandela book, obviously. So why did you decide to write this book at this time?
Well, I partially did it because I had spent my life as a journalist and a writer, and going into the State Department was an anthropological experience for me that I wanted to tell people about. I mean, it really was. There's a lot in the book, and some people have criticized it, about the byways and the arcane methods of the State Department and how wonderful and frustrating they can be. So some of it was just, I wanted to tell people about this, and actually the beginning of the acknowledgments, I thank Michael Beschloss, the great writer and historian, because I had lunch with him early on in the time I was in the State Department. I just started telling him stories about the State Department, and he said, you have to write a book about that. And it wasn't really until the events of the story happened that I thought there is a book here. And that happened because within a few weeks really of me being in office, two things happened. Nothing to do with me being in office. Was the Putin's annexation of Crimea, which is the southernmost part of Ukraine, and the first of the ISIS beheadings of Mr. Foley, the ABC News journalist. And so what I saw then was something I hadn't seen even in a lifetime of media, this kind of rise of disinformation around these two events. I mean, the rise of ISIS on Twitter, not only just what they were doing in Iraq and Syria, and then accompanied by Putin's lies about there being no Russian soldiers in Crimea, this flood of disinformation and on all different kinds of platforms that I had never really seen before, and I guess no one had seen before because it was new.
Yeah. I mean, we're, I think, within 5 or 6 years of each other's age. And when you think about how different news is today than it was when we were kids, because when you went to work, everybody had either watched Walter Cronkite or Peter Jennings the night before, right? And on Monday morning...
You guys know who Walter Cronkite was?
Yeah.
Okay.
And on Monday morning, what was everybody talking about over the donut machine? 60 Minutes that had been on the night before, right? And so we've kind of gone from that world where if you were in a small town in Iowa, or if you were in New York City, you were kind of getting the same, or you read Time Magazine, or you read Newsweek. And today, there's no one or two sources. And so how do we as a society, how do we as a global society move forward and find information that we can trust?
Well, I'm actually kind of an information exceptionalist. I think this is the most glorious era of information ever. And that era that we talked about, there's a fantastic essay by Eric Raymond called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And I think it was like 1999. It was about open source systems. Mm-hmm. But it's an analogy of how media used to be. It used to be a cathedral. A few people on high preached down to everybody on the low about what was important. That's what, because the people at the head of the New York Times and the Washington Post and CBS News,
Time Magazine
made decisions about what people should get. Now, by and large, those were good decisions, and they were decisions informed by the public's need to know and this idea that journalism was a kind of form of public service. But what happened with the rise of social media and the internet was we turned into a bazaar, which is instead of one to many, it was one to one. And look, the internet is the greatest source of information in history. I remember, in 2000, you could just, for the first time on your phone, you could get the entire contents of the British Museum Library. I mean, that's just a revolutionary thing in human history. Mm-hmm. The change, though, with social media, which I talk about in the book, particularly at the end, and I'm sorry to get
no, I'm glad.
Too far out of my skis. The difference there was, in the cathedral model, those were professional journalists creating content. the rise of social media, which was partially enabled by the Communications and Decency Act of 1996, which I'll get to, is this is media created by you and me, everybody, user-generated content. Actually got much laughed at and criticized, and I forget what my second year at Time when I made you, i.e. user-generated content.
Person of the year.
Person of the year. and then the thing I loved is that many young people at the end of their resume would say, Time Person of the Year. But the difference was this was content created by everybody. And that is a potential problem, right? Because who's delivering your content? Not this professional person at CBS News, but your friends, right? And particularly on Facebook, where there are loose ties, people you barely know who are, and so that's a different model of getting information, and that has been the cause of the rise of so much disinformation and misinformation and fake news, as somebody calls it. So I actually have a remedy for that, which we can get to at the end. But that's
well, let's get to it now because you talk about media literacy and some other things. So how are we going to move forward? I mean, with a shocking number of people in this country who think really bizarre things about all sorts of issues, how do we move forward as a society when so many people are able to believe things that are just flat out?
Well, so there's two ways. I mean, as Cecile mentioned, I talk in the book about we don't have a fake news problem, we have a media literacy problem. People can't tell the difference, and we haven't trained them to tell the difference between fact and fiction, the way journalists learn it, the way scholars learn it with footnotes and primary and secondary sources. Everybody needs to be taught that just in the regular course of business because that's how you get your information. So people can't, there was a study I mentioned in the book, I think, that from Pew, that middle schoolers, the lion's share of 80% of middle schoolers couldn't tell the difference between a real story and a promoted ad. And one of the things I say in the book is that those promoted stories at the bottom of websites that look at what such and such a movie star from the 1960s looks like now, which is a promoted content, and I forget the name, Jabula and all these things. Get rid of them. I don't care how much money you make from that crap. It pollutes the environment. It distorts the news that's right above it. People weigh it and they think it's similar. It's not. And I have other recommendations. But the other point, the legislative solution is the reason that these social media companies grew was that in that Communications and Decency Act of 1996, before Facebook was even invented, legislators had actually a good idea, which was we want to promote the rise of this new industry, right? So here's what they did. They said, because you're publishing third-party content, you are not liable for it the way Time Magazine is, or CBS News, or the Chicago Tribune, because it's not professional stuff. So they had a complete blanket immunity from being sued for any of the content on their platform, and they weren't considered publishers. Well, cut to 2019, they're the biggest publishers in the history of the world by an exponential margin. They're just not publishing professional content. They need to have more liability for the content that they publish. Can't be like Time Magazine has, which is a finite amount of information every week, but they have to make a good faith effort, I argue, to take off demonstrably false information, i.e. fake news, things like deep fakes, hate speech, speech that directly or indirectly could lead to violence. They should be liable for publishing that, and that's why they should take it off their platform. And if the laws change, and even people are arguing getting rid of Section 230 entirely, which gives them immunity, but I do think that will go a long way towards actually changing the information ecosystem.
Is there a way that we could change the way advertising is tax deductible? In other words, if there's websites that promise to abide by certain common journalistic and other standards, and putting ads on there would be tax deductible. But if you want to put an ad on a neo-Nazi site, I don't get to help you pay for it.
So I agree with that. But the other point that I make that makes me unpopular with my brethren, or former brethren, is what also happened with the rise of the internet and the rise of third-party content is the rise of automated advertising online. So when I ran Time, there was that beginning of the big revenue that's coming from digital advertising compared to traditional advertising. It's still, when I was there, it still wasn't as big. I think for the first time last year, digital advertising not only passed print advertising, it passed television advertising, which has always been the king. But because of the brilliance of the internet and the way algorithms work, people don't buy ads against brands anymore. They don't go, hey, I want to buy an ad in Time Magazine. I want to buy an ad in the New York Times. I want to buy an ad in the Chicago Tribune. I want to buy an ad on Chicago Tonight. They buy by categories, and they buy by age groups, and they buy by demographics. So it's like, I remember people used to say that when they bought an ad in Time, Time was a 50-50 demographic between men and women, 50-50 between blue and red. It's a hard publication to edit. But someone would go like, I'm only trying to reach women, so I'm wasting half of my money in Time Magazine, or I'm only trying to reach men, so I'm wasting half my money. But now, with automated advertising, if I'm trying to reach young men between 18 and 24 to sell them sneakers, that's how I type in the ad. And by the way, what do young men between 18 and 24 look at? A lot of
Porn.
Crappy stuff. I know, because I have two of them that used to be at home. So, so it's like, so people complain. So Nike complains, well, I'm next to pornography, or I'm next to the violent content. Well, yeah, because you're selling ads to 18 to 24-year-olds.
Yeah.
So part of that kind of automated advertising. I see two of my son's friends laughing there. They're even worse than my sons. They're too big there. So again, you're not going to put the genie back in the box, but there's some places that where now people buy ads for brands, and I think advertisers who've gotten away scot-free in this whole rise of disinformation and fake news need to have someone point the finger at them.
Yeah, and as someone who did a lot of media analysis, which is one of the keys, right? It's you can't respond to something if you don't know what you should be responding to. What you're talking about makes it very difficult to know what's out there, because I don't see the same ads that someone who is a registered right-wing Republican Christian living in Iowa, right? I don't see any of those ads. I don't see the Facebook stories. So I don't even know they're out there. So one day I wake up in the fall of 2016 and I find out that there's all these people who think completely differently than my friends do. And in the olden days, which weren't so olden from our perspective anyway, you would have seen all these different viewpoints in one place, hopefully, or maybe not. So how do we even know what everyone is hearing if we're only seeing stories and ads and whatever that's geared for very specifically for us? So
again, I'm going to articulate this point of view. I don't completely agree with it. It's sort of the confirmation bias point of view. I agree with confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is this idea that we seek out information that we agree with, and we reject information that we don't agree with. We're human beings. Cass Sunstein, who used to teach here many years ago, and now he teaches at the University of Chicago of Massachusetts, called Harvard, wrote a whole book about early on that part of the difference, again, with social media and the internet is that media became pull, something you could solicit yourself rather than push. In the cathedral model was you push it on people. The bizarre model is you pull it yourself. And because people were choosing what content they consumed, they were just choosing content that confirmed what they already believed. Mm-hmm. I do think this idea that old media was more serendipitous is a bit of a canard. My father read the New York Times every day. He got the New York Times viewpoint on things, and I'm not saying that's what the right wing views it
But
as.
he saw all the ads that were in the New York Times, whereas I'm not seeing the same ads that you're seeing or that they're seeing.
But even then, remember, people were buying ads in the New York Times because there was a certain reader that they had. So I actually think the potential for serendipity on the internet is just much greater. You could type in, hey, Google, show some things to me that I disagree with, and you'll get it.
Okay.
That was harder to do in the old days when you just had, kind of old-fashioned media that was pushed on you. So, and the other interesting stat about this is I saw this the other day. Pew poll. Pew is, I think, the best pollster in the world. And the single most polarized class of voters in America are people who don't use the internet at all. And that is older people.
Yeah.
And by the way, the people who, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not, I'm an older person now, but I'll tell you a funny story about that. So when I worked for Time,
Yeah.
we worked with CNN. We worked both under Time Warner, and we were going to do a joint project with a news show, which I won't mention, probably not even on anymore. And I said to him, like, to the executive producer, "Who's your audience?" And he said, "Our audience is old people and their parents." People who consume news are older and have been forever.
Yeah.
I actually think, again, there are interesting numbers that younger people are consuming more news and information than they have historically. So I'm a little bit contrarian on that subject. I wish, it was more seen in the electorate, but there's more availability of different points of view, I think, now than ever. Not that people are availing themselves of it.
Yeah, and just a word about the greatest generation and the silent generation. My mother is right in between those two. I mean, I really feel for my mother because she watches the news and she'll hear something that's completely made up. But she was from a generation where you believed what people taught you, I mean, I really feel for folks. And do you guys find that with some of your parents and your grandparents, that they just believe things because they're from a generation where it's hard to believe that somebody would be on the TV flat out lying to you? So, I mean, God love them for that.
But again, I'm also a little contrarian about that too, because our generation, or roughly our generation, we were also told that if we put our heads under our desk during a nuclear
that we would survive.
attack, we would be fine.
But I always knew that was a bunch of BS.
Oh, okay, all right.
I was down there and I was like, this is just stupid. I'm not going to survive. Yeah. I mean, didn't you know it was stupid?
I believed it.
I mean, I grew up.
Walter Cronkite told me that.
There you go. I grew up 30 miles from nuclear weapons silos, so we were pretty sure we weren't going to survive. But anyway, well, that's okay. So on to a happier topic. All right, so that is we've kind of skipped the beginning part, which is how we skipped part of we skipped the beginning part and we moved directly to half of
Yes.
the end of the book, which
Right.
is what we can do in the US.
Yes.
But since we're at the end of the book, let's also talk about how we are going to counter disinformation around the world. Because that's really what most of your book is about.
Yes.
It's about countering ISIS, countering Russia in the US and in other countries. You don't talk too much about countering China, but that's, I think, an increasing concern.
Yeah.
So globally, tell us a little bit about the work that you did in the State Department globally to try to counter disinformation in other countries.
Yes. So what I'm going to do is also give you a little bit of a thematic overview of the book, because I had this little department under me at the State Department called the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. Terrible name. Government has terrible names. But it was created by Hillary Clinton to combat a terrorist organization that was using radical new social media online called Al-Qaeda, because they put a guy on a hillside and let him speak into camera and they loaded it up to YouTube. That was revolutionary. But they saw ISIS coming. And then I got involved in creating the first kind of counter-Russian disinformation entity at the State Department that ended up growing into something else. But the through line that connected ISIS and the Russians and this guy named Donald Trump was the following: what I call the weaponization of grievance. That ISIS partially grew, at least from an ideological sense, from this idea that Sunni Muslims felt left out of the modern world and were repressed by their leaders in the Sunni nations in the Middle East. By the way, they're right about that. They have terrible leaders. And when ISIS' motto was, I mean, and I'm making this up, but it's true, was, let's make Islam great again. Right? Vladimir Putin came to power. He was a KGB officer in Dresden when the wall fell. Not a very successful KGB officer if you're in Dresden, right? But he saw the wall fall without a single bullet being fired. It wasn't American hard power. It was American soft power that brought the end of the wall, including the fact that we had a lot of hard power. And that taught him a lesson, right? which is that soft power, TV, media, is super important. And I actually in the book, I talk a little bit about, I interviewed Putin in 2007, and I don't say in the book that I made him Person of the Year at the time, which a lot of people at the State Department dig me for. But in that interview, he said, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Think about how that sounds to an American, right? But he truly believed it. So part of his whole rise to power was for these Russians who felt dispossessed, who felt suddenly like capitalism is coming in a country where they never had choice, that was part of an empire and now is just a local place that makes vodka and exports oil. What was Putin's slogan? Make Russia great again.
Yeah.
And then along comes, you know, the yellow-headed buffoon, and he's weaponizing grievance of Americans, of white Americans in the Middle West and elsewhere who feel left out by the modern world, who felt, you know, it wasn't globalization, it was really automation, that people lost their jobs, people weren't exporting them. People who felt, and again, legitimately so in my book, our estimation, you know, government didn't help them. Like, what happens when I lose my job? Why isn't someone training me for a new job or telling me that these jobs are going away? I mean, I think, unfortunately, government, one of the flaws of government is we're a sink or swim society. We don't help people that are sinking as much as we should, which is a whole other story. But Trump came along and said, let's make America great again, which said to them the same thing that ISIS said to Sunni Muslims and the same thing that Putin said to Russians, which is, hey, you've been left out, you've been kicked to the curb, I'm going to do something for you, I'm speaking to you. And it resonated with people. Yeah. So that was the through line connecting these three things. And you know, the question is, what can government do about it? You know, you have to read a whole book to sort of come to the conclusion that I actually don't think government can do that much about it. I don't think that America should be in the business of responding to propaganda with propaganda, should be in the business of responding to disinformation with disinformation. We talked about and thought about, do we start our own version of the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg? We could hire a bunch of people and put them in a warehouse and tell them to start tweeting and pretend to be Russian or pretend to be Muslims, and we don't do that. No. And what the conclusion I came to was the best thing that we can do as a government, and by the way, you were in the State Department, you know, I mean, we can help other people who are better at it than we are. Yeah. You know, I remember being in the Situation Room at the White House, which is way smaller and stinkier than you can ever imagine that it would be. And one of the guys, white guys at the table, and we were talking about counter-ISIS messaging, and he looked around and he said, maybe we're not the best messengers for this message. Yeah. Which is exactly right. And it's not even just white males, it's the US government. Right. Because remember, a message from the US government to a young man in Turkey who's thinking of going to fight for ISIS in Iraq and Syria, it's like, I'm not really going to persuade that kid to not go. I'm the enemy. So he interprets that as something which bolsters his argument to go. So what could we do? We started helping organizations of mainstream Muslims, the overwhelming lion's share of whom rejected ISIS's ideology, that were on social media saying, hey, ISIS kills more Muslims than anybody else in the world. I mean, you're going to go there and get killed yourself. Yeah. By the way, we found that the single most effective piece of social media to dissuade young men from going to Iraq and Syria was, you'll lose your phone when you're there. You won't be able to take selfies and send them home. I'm not going, is what a lot of kids said. So I just didn't think government should be in the business of creating content. As you know, people in government don't like creating content. Right. They're not good at it, and it also rings like a deaf ear on people who receive it.
But what we could do is be the opposite of the people that our enemies think that we are, and then let all these other people kind of spread the word. And so, you know, I'll give you an example. We brought together a group of religious clerics in Pakistan when I was in a senior job there. And I was invited to come speak to them, and there was a counterpoint view because we were trying to be fair, and it was a governor, and he spent 2 hours doing nothing but berating the U.S. And I got up and tried to just be a nice person and say nice things and tell them how much I appreciated all the work they're doing. I told my personal story about my father, the Holocaust survivor, and how much freedom of religion meant to me. And afterwards, no one would shake that governor's hand, but they all wanted to get their photos taken with me to take back to their villages and to talk about what the American had said about their religion. And they were shocked. I mean, and it's really sad that they were shocked, but it's what they had been fed about Americans hating Islam. So to have someone standing up there who tried to form a bond with them, I hope had some kind of positive effects in the future, because they went back and talked about me, I hope. I don't know.
So, yes, in a perfect world, I think that's true. I mean, I traveled to the Middle East a lot during the time I was at the State Department. I went to all those Sunni countries. I talked to we have information ministries. I can't tell you how many times people asked me, do you have mosques in America?
Yeah.
It's very depressing.
It is depressing.
By the way, the number of mosques in America have increased tenfold since 9/11. It's a big growth industry.
Yeah.
But do we talk about having mosques in America? We do, but people don't know. I found the kind of ignorance of America to be almost impenetrable. And even, the other thing that I found a little bit depressing too is what an incredible outlier the First Amendment is around the world. People don't get it at all. I had so many Arab ministers say to me, why do you allow a minister in Florida to burn the Koran? Well, the First Amendment. Justice Holmes, the First Amendment is to protect not the thought that we love, but the thought that we hate. It's a lovely, lovely idea. It's an idea that nobody around the world really gets. And it made me rethink the incredibly broad umbrella that the First Amendment has in our country. And I think this rise of disinformation has also made me rethink it about, do we have some version of hate speech laws like the Europeans have? Not as stringent. And by the way, the other thing that people don't realize is that, the social media platforms do have their own versions of hate speech laws. I mean, I thought Mark Zuckerberg didn't do a fantastic job of articulating this, but they take off content that attacks people by virtue of race and gender and ethnicity and religion. They take off content that it preaches violence and might directly or indirectly lead to violence. They do that. The First Amendment protects almost all of that. And I'm not so sure anymore that that's a good thing, and it may be a design flaw.
Can we talk for a minute, because I was very interested in the one criticism that you had of the Obama administration, where you said that they were unwilling to reach out to senior editors and to American news publications and say, you guys are not really paying enough attention to what Russia's up to in the disinformation realm. Or can you talk about kind of that, because I experienced a similar thing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, that was President Obama who cut me off when I suggested that. But I think one of the, and I'm, I love Barack Obama, but he had this idea, and a lot of people around him did, is that appearances are not as important as reality. Well, I agree with that in general. Yeah. But, I mean, governing is also about appearances. And I always felt that, if I were his communications director or campaign manager, it's like, hey, you got to be telling people all the time about the stuff that you're doing and how great it is, and, why you were smart to vote for me and all of this stuff. He's allergic to doing that, right? It's a noble human impulse. But it's not a great impulse in politics. And so I had, at one point, he asked me, what would you do about this rise of disinformation? And it was like I hadn't actually really prepared for it at this meeting. And I said, I think you should bring in the leaders and editors of every major news organization and platform to the White House and school people about this, tell them that this is happening. And he rejected it out of hand. And in part because it's not the sort of thing that he liked to do, and he didn't see that as the role of government. I mean, he really governed, right? That's a rare thing. But he didn't believe in marketing or doing publicity around his governing. I mean, I remember he used to say, like, I'm not going to do this action because the appearance of it will make people like it better. You know, I'm going to do it because it's either the right or the wrong thing to do. Yeah. Again, a noble sentiment, but not in 21st century democracy. And I don't know if it would have made a difference. And I also say, you know, once we really knew the extent of Russian disinformation, the hard end of the kind of cyber attacks on the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, as well as the Internet Research Agency and that. I mean, you know, you could give an Oval Office address a month before the election and say, look, we're under attack in a way that we've never been before. The most sacred organ of our society, democratic and free elections, is being interfered with by a hostile foreign power. I can't tell you exactly what's happening everywhere or where you live. I'm just telling you, you got to be aware of this. And we have to be vigilant about this, and you know, we're going to help you try to work your way through it. I mean, it would have caused a furor, and it's easy to say in retrospect, but I think in retrospect, that would have been the right thing to do.
In retrospect, I would have liked to have known as an American citizen, and I think a lot of American citizens feel that way.
There was actually, when I went back and worked on the book, there was way more publicity about it. I mean, the intelligence community had done a couple of reports. You know, it kept getting buried by stuff that Trump was doing and stuff that the Russians were doing. They were smart. They did counter-programming. So, I mean, I think one of the most comprehensive reports about Russian interference in the election came out on the day before or the same day as the Access Hollywood tape. Well,
yeah. Yeah.
you know, what are you going to pay attention to? So, and that's, again, part of the problem of social media is that the economic model is based on virality, not truth.
But is that something that someone in the White House should have, you know, when all these papers were putting the wrong thing on the front page and we're leading with the wrong stories different places, was there anyone in the White House saying, you know, listen, what are you doing here? I mean, you know, calling them and saying, you know, we see what you're doing and it doesn't make sense to us.
Well, I'm sure there were, and there are people that I talked to about it and people who cottoned to the extent of the problem. But remember, the other thing was going on was, particularly in the last few weeks of the election, what was Donald Trump doing and what was being echoed by the Russians while they were hacking all 50 state, trying to hack all 50 state election centers? It's a rigged election. Yeah. It's a rigged election. How many times did he say that? And the good guys, us, and I'm talking about their point of view, is we don't want to give him more information so that the day after the election, he says it's a rigged election, it's an illegitimate election, Hillary Clinton is an illegitimate president. No one wanted to put their finger on the scale and give him ammunition to do that. So that was the countervailing idea. Again, I mean, if she had won, maybe that was the right idea. But that was the impetus for not doing what I was saying to do. And you know, I also tell the story in the book. At the end of the book, I ended up, I don't even know how it happened, you would know how wacky this is, doing a trip to Russia, to Moscow, 2 weeks before the election.
Yeah.
Very State Department thing, because the Moscow embassy wanted to spend $20 million on, Russia had closed down all of our educational places around Russia, American corners, they're called other things that we used to give American books, and you could read Huck Finn and Russian. And they had systematically closed them over the last few years. And now the embassy wanted to build this new, you know, great new theater where Russians could come and hear about stuff. And they'd been begging me to come, and finally I said yes. and somehow the State Department approved it. Well, the White House and the National Security Council were like crazy. You're going to Russia 2 weeks before the election? You can't talk about Trump. You can't talk about the election. You can't talk about this guy Vladimir Putin. You can't talk about Russia even canceling all these programs. I mean, it was the most anodyne visit possible, in part because nobody wanted to give anybody ammunition that, hey, we were conspiring against the election of this guy, Donald Trump.
So speaking of being very...
That's depressing, isn't it?
It was.
See, everybody's looking very down about all of this now. We have to have an uplifting ending.
So, well, I don't know if this is going to be uplifting. Well, we still have question time, so they'll be uplifting.
Gretchen was looking particularly down.
Just, quickly, I worked for a lot of presidents in my career, and the one who had the reins on people talking to the press and interacting with the press the most in terms of the Foreign Service was the Obama administration. The one who encouraged us to go out and do our jobs and to try to spread the good word and even told us, if you've done your best job and something happens, we'll have your back, was George W. Bush, of all people. And I have one story that perhaps people will relate to. When I first got to Chicago, I was still working for the State Department. President Obama had announced his desire to bring, I think, 50,000 more Syrian refugees to the United States. He was getting beaten up around the country. Chicago Tonight called and asked if I would go on their show and explain the proposal. And I desperately wanted to do this. And I called Public Affairs. And I said, you guys know me. You can trust me, I hope. I really want to do this TV show. I really want to do it. It's personally extremely important to me. And they said, Cecile, we wish we could approve you, but the word from the White House is no one under an undersecretary speaks on the record on this issue anywhere in the country. So there's like 4 people, not counting the president, who therefore can speak publicly on this issue. So think of so maybe they'll speak to what, Face the Nation,
right.
New York Times, no local news, no blogosphere, no podcasts, all new media completely without representation on this issue. And I just thought that was such a lost opportunity.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. I mean,
couldn't agree more.
At some point you have to trust the thousands of people out in the field.
Oh, I remember when I first went into the State Department, and because I'd been a TV person, I think my second or third week I was invited on Face the Nation.
Yeah.
Rejected by the White House. They approved every single person who's on a Sunday show every weekend.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a little like Jimmy Carter, knowing who's playing on the White House tennis court. I mean, it's a little bit of micromanaging.
And I think it was a real lost opportunity, both in terms of U.S. media, but also sometimes I wasn't allowed to say the letters TPP in Japan.
Yeah.
So, and actually,
but by the way, it was the Republicans who rejected us taking in more Syrian refugees.
Ultimately. But you're assuming, therefore, that if you're a Republican in Iowa, you don't care about this issue, whereas maybe if you're watching TV or listening to a podcast or something and your mind is open, you'll change your mind. But if we're not even going to talk to people who disagree to us, then they aren't going to change their minds. So we have now, that was a great conversation.
Thank you.
We're going to go to questions and answers now, and hopefully you'll have a chance to talk about the future of public service, because I think we're both a little worried.
I'll get that in there.
Yeah. So I'm going to put on my glasses because I'm old. And if you could just say your name, and just as a reminder, this is on the record and we're live streaming. So, okay?
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
So first, thank you both so much for coming tonight. My name is Estrella Hernandez, and I'm a first year at the college here. My question would be in regards to social media companies becoming the biggest publishers of information. What approach should they take to counter disinformation? Would it tend more towards deplatforming or giving disclaimers about where content originates from? And then also, as consumers and as constituents of the United States, what our sort of response to this disinformation should be? How can we convince these companies that this is a serious issue? And what steps can we take to sort of impress the importance of addressing it upon them?
Very eloquent and important question.
Thank you, yes.
Thank you.
So I talked a little before about the Section 230 and why they're not considered publishers, and the content that they should take off if they're considered publishers: hate speech, violent speech, etc. Mark Zuckerberg's obviously been in the news lately, and at that speech he gave at Georgetown, he talked about this idea that political speech is more protected than regular speech, and it is. The court has always borne that out. That's why he said they will not take off an ad from a political candidate, even if it contains something demonstrably false. It's a valid argument that you can make that these people, that, the President of the United States is a newsmaker. Something he says, even when it's false, especially when it's false, has news value. I would argue there's a higher standard, and that if there's demonstrably false content in an ad, it should come off. I don't know that that's going to happen. What they've also announced, and the other platforms do this, is that all political advertising is now much more transparent. You can see who's bought the ad. You can see why you've been targeted. I think that's absolutely essential. I think that should be for every ad that you see in your news feed or on whatever platform you're on. That would also help with the kind of a media literacy and digital literacy. And in fact, I think this kind of extreme transparency should apply to journalistic organizations too. Why not see the full text of the interview that I quoted only once from? Why not see the research that I did? I mean, I was a reporter for a long time, and it's like, that's a lot of extra work. Well, it would also teach people about how the house of information is built, and they would trust it more. So I think all of these things can be done, and I think the platform companies should pay for media literacy education across the country. So, is that going to any of that help us for 2020? Maybe, maybe not. But the long term, those are the things that need to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vishan. I'm a first year at the college. Thank you both for being here. I wanted to go back to what you were talking about at the end about sort of reaching out to people who we disagree with. Specifically, so you wrote an article for Time about a decade ago called The Case for National Service, in which you laid out why national service is an important part of democratic citizenship.
That's why I had to go into government, because I wrote that.
I'm wondering if you would support what your thoughts are on a national service program to help educate people about media literacy, et cetera, to help combat disinformation, and how effective you think that would be.
That's an interesting idea, a new idea to me. That the case for national service was this idea that every young person in America in the year between high school and college should do some form of national service, whether it's military service, volunteer service, some kind of government service.
Yeah.
Lots of smart people, have been promoting this. There's an organization I'm on the board of that the Admiral McCraven and a bunch of generals run. I mean, it's a great idea. I think your idea, this idea that there ought to be some kind of service related to media literacy, civic literacy, that's a really interesting idea. And how would it work? If you're making it up, let's make it up.
I don't know. I guess I would think of people who are familiar with the problems of disinformation going into communities that maybe aren't so sure, communities that they don't traditionally engage with, and talking about it, because that would not only, I guess, help educate them about the harms of disinformation, but also, kind of just like a bridge the divide, reach across the aisle kind of.
Yeah. So like AmeriCorps is a multi-$100-million program. People go into communities, they teach, they help communities that need help. I mean, that's a very interesting idea. Sort of have kind of a public service media literacy officers. That's really interesting. You should write something about that.
I'll think about it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Good idea.
Hello, my name is Utsav. I'm a graduate student here at the School of Public Policy. I was wondering, in the research for your book or interactions over your career, what thoughts have you come up to now on human versus machine-enabled content moderation?
Oh, good question.
And just the pitfalls and the benefits of both, and how a company like Facebook can, change its current strategy towards.
Yeah. So I'm mindful that you may know more about this than I do, but and I didn't mention this. One of the things that I do call for is that one of the very simple things that the platform should do is inform users: is this content from a human being, or is this content from a bot? They know that. They strip out that information after it's been sent. I think that just would go a long way, whether it's an ad, whether it's a tweet, that you know that it's from a bot or a human being. I actually am a believer in the power of AI and artificial intelligence that can eliminate a lot of this content. So one of the things that I saw, and I talk about in the book, that the social media companies were actually really good and on the job and vigilant about getting off violent content, ISIS content, similar content. And a lot of that was done through AI. Again, Mark Zuckerberg says, I have quoted him in the book, and he has said recently that AI will get 80 to 85% of this stuff off. I actually believe that. But I do think some human moderation, and we saw this even in the ISIS area, because I remember, I talk about a meeting we had in Silicon Valley where it's like, you know, the very smart woman who runs YouTube, she said, yeah, we get rid of a lot of this stuff, but I can't tell whether that's a tweet from ISIS or the Syrian Defense Force, you know, the good guys that we support. I mean, that needs human moderation. You know, Arabic speakers, people who are familiar with the territory. So whatever that last 20% or 15% is, I think there needs to be human moderation. And in the case, again, of ISIS content, they hired hundreds and hundreds of Arab speakers to do that. And so I think it's a combination of the two. Thanks.
And, you know, a challenge for me, and I think for a lot of foreign service officers with social media, is we were trained to read a newspaper because that's how you pass the language test. You have to read the front page of the newspaper, and you have to read an editorial. And I can't understand a single tweet in Japanese because it's extremely colloquial, and I don't know what the heck they're talking about half the time. So, I mean, this is another challenge, is it really a second language on social media that can be hard for people to completely understand. Yeah. Hi. What's your question?
Hi, my name is Jenny. I'm a sophomore, and I was wondering, based off your commentary on the First Amendment and certain flaws that may be regarded by it, if it were to be abolished, what would be left behind in its place to try and monitor social media, and what do you think other foreign powers such as Russia would think of the decisions made by the government?
So I would never abolish the First Amendment, but I do think that states can pass an experiment with hate speech laws. Maybe it goes up to the Supreme Court to be decided. I mean, any restriction on the First Amendment is something that's super well protected and the courts spend a lot of time on. One of the problems of the First Amendment is that it does a whole lot better job of protecting false speech and the speech that we hate than the speech that we want. The underpinning of the First Amendment is this marketplace of ideas notion. I don't know if there are any law students here, but that comes from John Milton and John Stuart Mill, which is this idea that in a free system, the marketplace of ideas, good ideas will drive out bad ideas. I mean, you know, Thomas Jefferson said, you know, that given the free play of ideas, reason will win out over bad ideas. I mean, by the way, have you heard anybody mention the word reason anymore and using it as a noun like that? I mean, but these were Enlightenment guys. They believed that reason would triumph no matter what. That was the destiny. Well, I don't think reason is necessarily going to triumph. I think we've got to give reason a kick in the butt a little bit and help people do that. So, so I think being a little stricter about the speech that is tolerable. I mean, the First Amendment doesn't protect all speech, and it doesn't protect pornography and things like that. It doesn't protect defamatory speech, and it doesn't protect speech that directly or indirectly leads to violence, which was the Brandenburg case. But I think there can be some legislative scaffolding around the First Amendment to get some of this stuff out of our information ecosystem. I wouldn't abolish the First Amendment. Okay.
Hi.
In the Watergate era, Sam Ervin conducted public hearings of great gravity that became a focal point of public attention and to a great extent unified opinion around what to do with Nixon. Now, however, Democrats are conducting interviews in secret. My inclination is to think this is a terrible missed opportunity. What do you think?
I partially agree. I think public hearings are necessary and important. I think they will happen. I think during the discovery part of the trial that is an impeachment hearing. I mean, some of that has to go on in secret. I do think that the House should vote as a whole on starting the impeachment inquiry, which is something that has been prevented from happening. I do think later on that they'll start having public testimony, but in this stage, some of it has to go on in private. Of course, people leak all the information right afterwards, but I mean, one of the reasons that I support impeachment is that I think it serves an educational function. It shows people how the system works, how the Constitution works, how government works. I mean, more people learned about the separation of powers during the Watergate hearings than probably through any schoolwork. So I think there's a benefit of doing as much as possible in public. So I basically agree with you. But I think there's some reasons right now that they're doing it behind closed doors.
Hi, Stephen Spinello, a first-year student at the Harris School of Public Policy.
Are you from New Jersey?
I am.
How did I know that?
So my question has to do with Facebook. One of the things I find so interesting about Facebook is that it's really not people my age that are using it on a regular basis, at least not anymore, to consume news. So, as digital natives, quote unquote, we've sort of moved away from Facebook. This was more like 2015, 2016, right? The fastest growing demographic segment on Facebook now is people over the age of 55, which I find really interesting, to be frank, because I would argue these people are the most susceptible to fake news and disinformation because they haven't grown up with these platforms per se, so they're not as good as navigating that fake news minefield. So I would just like to know what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's a very good observation, and this kind of societal sense that we have that the only people on social media are young people in Generation X is of course false. And yeah, so the fastest growing segment on Facebook is people over 55. Part of, their economic model was that they had to branch out, right? I mean, they have 2.2 billion users. They're going to start having to have people that are older than 24. So, and I think you're right. I think older people are probably less savvy about distinguishing the provenance of information as younger people who grew up with it. So, so we need kind of the other gentlemen, we need people to go into the older communities and educate them about media literacy.
And it's also a challenge for governments because when I was in Tokyo, I wanted us to get an Insta page, and everyone was saying, no, you have to stay on Facebook. And I said, no, if we're going to reach the young people, we have to go on Insta. So it's hard for organizations to move quick. I don't even know I don't think you use Insta anymore, right? What do you all use now? TikTok. See, there you go. Which is owned by the Chinese.
Which is owned by the Chinese.
Yeah.
Right. So by the way, there have been now, I think, 2 Senate Intelligence Committee reports, but the second one came out just a couple of weeks ago, but the first one also broke new ground because they showed that the Russians did more on Instagram than they did on either Facebook or Twitter. Right. And so people just hadn't seen that. I mean, that's part of the difficulty is that it is hidden in plain sight. They adopt other personas and identities so you don't know that they're Russian. So that's why it's such a hard problem, both for older people and younger people.
Thank you.
The Nets are going to be good this year.
Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I'm a student at the Harris School of Public Policy, and I'm Obama scholar.
Where are you from?
I'm from Georgia.
Okay.
And so earlier you mentioned Ukraine's case several times. So my question is, Georgia is probably the country that struggles the most with Russia, with Russian troops still in Georgia, located still in Georgia. So my question would be, and Russian propaganda and Russian fake news is very powerful in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And they're mostly targeted and contain anti-Western and anti-US messages. So my question is, how do you think West could and the United States could help Georgia to fight Russian propaganda and Russian fake news?
Had you ever been to the US before when you came here as an Obama scholar?
Yes.
When did you come?
The last time?
Yeah.
Probably.
As a scholarship student or just to visit?
Just to visit.
So I'll tell this anecdote before I answer your question. So I don't know if you probably know what the Flex program
Yes, yes,
so the
sure.
Flex program, sponsored by Bill Bradley after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was this idea that Russian and students from other part of the Soviet Union would come for 1 year of study in high school. It's a fantastic program. At the State Department, I used to always speak to the students. And I remember speaking to them in the big auditorium, and I'd always ask them to tell stories about their experience. And they were lovely, lovely, lovely kids, and they told wonderful stories. But I remember a young woman, raised her hand, and I called on her, and I said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Georgia." "You're Georgia." And I said, "Well, where are you studying in high school?" And she said, "Georgia." And she said, "The sad thing is that none of the people I'm in high school with know about the Georgia where I come from." And part of the benefit of these exchange programs is not just for the kids who come here, but for the American students that they sit next to in the lunchroom, in the cafeteria, so they learn about these things. That is a benefit from it. But the punchline of the story is Vladimir Putin canceled the program in 2015. In retaliation, canceled Russian students. At the same time as right after he canceled the ability for Americans to adopt Russian orphans, which he resented. He also resented the Flex program, thought it was brainwashing Russian students. So that was an example of public diplomacy that was an effective program that the Russians curtailed. So look, the problem, so I went all over. I didn't go to Georgia, unfortunately, but I visited the Baltics. I visited all the countries pretty much on Russia's periphery. And of course, when I came to talk to them about fake news and disinformation, they laughed at me. He said, "Well, we've been the victim of this for 75 years. You guys know nothing about this." The Lithuanians, it's like, "Don't come and tell us about fake news. Bring us tanks and F-35. So that was also new to me. So it's an old problem to Georgia. Active measures, which is what Russians call it. They've been doing it, again, all during the Cold War. It's a much harder problem. It's a much harder problem on the periphery because when I told the story about Putin understanding that it was soft power, he helped build all of these Russian language entertainment stations and news stations throughout the periphery. Why? Because all of these countries are dual language. They speak Russian and Georgian. They speak Russian and Lithuanian. And so what the Russians realized was, if we create good entertainment content in Russian, people are going to watch it. So they started, what did they do? They copied all the reality TV shows that we do, the entertainment shows. It was really smart. Hard problem for the West, right? And it was a hard problem, too, because one of the things I tried to do is, hey, let's get more American programming there, right?
Yeah.
Well, here's the problem. And I went to see all the studios in Hollywood. Well, the Georgians can't afford Three's Company or any of these American sitcoms, much less Game of Thrones or any of these things that are really expensive. And the Russians give away their content for free. So when I was traveling around the Baltics, in the beginning I laughed when they'd say to me, the foreign minister would say, "Why can't we get Netflix here?" Ha ha ha. Well, it's a darn good question. Netflix is an incredible engine of American soft power. And about 9 months after that, the head of Netflix announced they were expanding to 140 countries. I can't tell you how many foreign ministers called me to thank me. You really have a lot of power, Mr. Stengel. I had nothing to do with it. But it makes a difference. And so I actually think more Western content is a good thing. I think there are things that we have learned about responding to disinformation and how to do it. And one of the things that I supported as Undersecretary were programs in Ukraine to help organizations. I don't even know if this is, if I'm allowed to say this, but there was a great organization in Ukraine called Stop Fake, which was focused on countering disinformation. We helped fund it. We helped teach them. We started these computer camps, digital training camps for investigative journalists in the Russian periphery. I assume there are some programs, I hope there are some programs in Georgia that do that. I'd be happy to talk more about it with you, but it's a really hard problem, and those are just some...
It is.
Yeah, it is. What would you do?
I think that we have a strong support from the United States. We have we have programs, we have these educational exchange programs, but I think United States could support more.
I agree. I agree.
Would it really cost that much for the U.S. government to throw some money at the studios so they can put Blackish and Modern Family on television in Georgia?
Well, so that's an interesting question. So I explored this idea of could the State Department subsidize the Hollywood studios so that they could sell Blackish and Modern Family? But, I mean, what do you think the answer was?
Yeah, I mean,
We can't, no.
they don't. The State Department does not deal with anything new in a good way.
Yeah, so
Yeah, exactly.
I actually helped fund
Yeah.
some money for PBS to sell and give documentaries away in the Russian periphery and translate them into Russian. So that was another big thing. But again, it's just a tiny little drop in the ocean. That's the problem.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I will tip that down. I'm Lori Cohn. I'm from the community and love the programming here at the IOP. I've taken great advantage of it and brought my daughter. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming. Thank you for a wonderful program. My question is what your thoughts are about disinformation that's provided through, amongst others, Fox News, which we haven't really talked about. But where, and if you want a specific, whether it's the Seth Rich conspiracy or other quote unquote fake news or conspiracy theories that are disseminated so widely and seen as news when in fact the journalistic standards are in some cases less about journalism and more opinion shows, but they're not really framed that way for the general public. And so the message is more fuzzy and has been seen to influence people perhaps in some less than savory ways.
That's a good question, and it's a controversial one.
I know, and I'm trying to figure out how to frame it less controversially, but
So
I'll leave you to answer.
Okay,
it
so
way.
my answer may be unpopular. I think that for all of the disinformation and misinformation and propaganda on Fox News, they have to be included in the sort of normative window of what news is in America. I'm on the board of an organization called NewsGuard, which does these kind of good housekeeping seal of approvals on news sites so that, and you can put it in your browser and they evaluate, I mean, something like 2,000 news sites, domestic and foreign, to just say, hey, this site is kosher, and as opposed to some that are not. They don't evaluate every story. But if you don't give Fox News whatever good housekeeping seal of approval as a news organization where you should evaluate the content, but no matter where you get your news, you need to evaluate the veracity of the content, then we're really, really, really polarized, right? You're saying that the news source of a large percentage of Americans that they trust is completely polluted and should be, taken off the air, basically. I don't think we can do that. As much as I don't like or support Fox News, they still, there are many, many, many journalists who work there, many, many, many people who are good journalists who are trying to report things fairly. They have even some of their, stars are people who, I mean, how many times has Chris Wallace?
Chris Wallace is maybe the best anchor out there working.
And unfortunately, the guy who just announced
Smith.
that he was leaving, Shep
Isn't
Smith.
that his last name, Smith?
Yeah.
So I think, by the way, does that speak more to the audience when Shep Smith or Chris Wallace grills a Trump administration official and says you're saying falsehoods than Rachel Maddow doing that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so, to that audience. So I think, yes, I'd like them to be better. Yes, I think they fall for, in part because of confirmation bias, conspiracy theories like the Seth Rich thing, which is inexcusable. But it's part of our news ecosystem, for better or for worse, and we have to hold them accountable, just like we have to hold news organizations that are on the other end of the spectrum accountable.
But the Democrats don't have anything similar.
Oh, I think they do sometimes.
well,
I mean, so my complaint. We'll go to the next question, but you know, this idea that you have to give both sides of the view, even when the other side is just not a side, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's a problem on all of the news networks right
Yeah,
now.
so that's one of the things I talk about. The press's reflex towards balance is used by the bad guys because it's like when Putin says there are no Russian troops in Crimea,
Yeah.
everybody reports that. They have to report it. And I used to say to Foreign Service officers, there aren't two sides to a lie. You don't have to give both sides. But, you know, if there was a guy, but, you know, I watch CNN, I don't go on CNN, but, you know, if during the campaign a Trump person said the moon is made out of green cheese, they would have a scientist on to say, no, the moon is made out of rock. But they'd also have a scientist saying, yes, I think the moon is made out of green cheese.
Well, the scientists would
That's
be in
balance,
quotes.
right?
Yeah.
No, that's not balance.
Yeah, no,
That's
exactly.
A falsehood doesn't have two sides. So I think the bad guys manipulate this reflex towards balance, but I think journalists have to realize, you know, balance isn't a virtue when one side is factually incorrect.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Okay, we're going to play a little game here. You each get like 15 seconds to ask your question. We're going to see if we can wrap all 3 questions into one question that you will then have 90 seconds
Oh,
to answer.
that's so hard. How about fast, quick, short questions, fast answers?
Short question, fast answers. We'll do it that way. Okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
So, hi, my name is Rosario. I'm a graduate student at the Harris School, and also an Obama scholar. I'm from Peru, and my question is, so in a context, in an international context, where, for instance, in some countries, the media institutions or companies are part of a holding, and then the information somehow kind of relates, or it's very similar. How do we see social media as a tool that can democratize information and that can actually give them the opportunity to people to point to some things that are actually happening on the territories? Okay. 2 little examples. Right now in Chile, the crisis that is going on, how the media is not showing the huge repression by the Chilean government and how people is using social media such as Facebook in order to show how they are being treated. And also another little example is how in the Latin American region, which is the region that has the biggest amount of environmental activist murderers, we don't see anything that on our media.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, very good question. I mean, and part of the premise is, in most places around the world, there's the state media is the way most people get their information. So that's government media. I do think that social media is the most democratizing force in information in human history. And what actually changed my mind, for example, about Twitter was when I was editor of Time. I think it was 2012, I guess, the Green Revolution in Iran, the almost Green Revolution, where people were reporting about the demonstrations and attacks by government troops on Twitter in real time. And I thought, wow, God, this is just kind of fantastic. Yeah. That's news reporting. It's individual people who are taking pictures and reporting on stuff. That's incredibly valuable. And I think in Chile and other places, people should be on all those platforms. The danger in our world now is repressive governments are shutting down social media. I mean, how many times did Erdogan try to shut down Twitter? I mean, they're going to eventually sort of figure it out. And then, of course, in a lot of repressive places, like in Russia, they create their own version of Facebook, VKontakte. The Chinese create their own version of Facebook. I mean, and people are not on Facebook, and they're on these government platforms that mimic it, where you don't have as much free speech. So it's a good question. But I think social media can really help in all those places, including Chile.
Okay. Quick.
Hi, I'm Isadora. I'm a first-year student in the college. My question for you is that, so historically we see examples in U.S. history of times when, legislation that has infringed upon free speech for the sake of the well-being of the country has kind of adversely impacted oppressed groups more so than the general class. I'm thinking specifically of like the Espionage Act, in which a lot of the speech oppression or suppression that happened there was that of like working class people, or we can see examples of when Native Americans were not fully permitted to express their cultural or just their culture. So how do you feel sure that steps taken to prevent or to fight disinformation wouldn't do the same if there were to be legislation surrounding that, or what are some safeguards that could be taken to prevent these issues?
Yeah, really good question. And the arc of the First Amendment, even just over the course of the 20th century, was about applying it to people who had been not enfranchised. African Americans, minority groups, Japanese Americans. So the First Amendment has gone in absolutely the right direction, and it has included people that were traditionally excluded from that kind of free speech umbrella. So that's why I think it is dangerous, as you said, to tamper with it. And how do you protect the freedoms of people who were formerly disenfranchised from being affected by potential restrictions? I think that's why it's a very, very delicate line, and smarter people than me need to figure it out. But those people also bear the brunt of hate speech as well. And, I don't know. I would talk to them too about saying, well, in this balance, where do you come down? Do you want your speech more protected, or do you want to have the speech of other people restricted because they're inflicting hate speech upon you? But I do think I am optimistic about all of these things. I do think a lot of these problems are solvable. I think, even like the framers, the more information, the better. The famous James Madison line in a letter where he said, popular government without popular information is either a prologue to a farce or a tragedy or both. We're sort of seeing that now, but I do think that even though I think the marketplace model is mostly broken, I do think more people speaking truth, more people understanding how to suss out facts from fiction is something that will help save the republic.
Thank you. And more people from more parts of the country, more cultural backgrounds, will make us stronger.
I agree.
Because we need all of your ideas, all of you young people in government, if maybe not your whole 30-year career or 40-year career, but at some point, as Rick did, because no offense to the graduates of Princeton, but we need graduates of every university in this country and people with all kinds of backgrounds.
Absolutely, and I truly believe in public service. One of the things that I've always hated about this swamp metaphor, thank you, is that the overwhelming number of people in Washington, the people who work in the agencies, they're all there for the right reasons. They're public servants, they're patriotic, they're not doing it for big salaries, they're doing it at great sacrifice. Congress is pretty swampy, but and most people think Congress is Washington. It's not.
Right.
There are millions of people who work in Washington that are doing it for the right reasons, and even just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, career Foreign Service officers from the State Department, risking their careers by disobeying the Secretary of State who's saying that you shouldn't testify, and they do that. And those are the people, who are helping save the republic.
Thank you.
That's an optimistic note.
That is.
To end on.
We're over here, over this way. So Rick's going to stay around and sign books for those of you who have purchased one, and they are for sale still for those of you who have not yet purchased one. So thank you once again, Rick.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.
That was great. Thank you.